the capacity of working, the office hours, a lot of administrative things for the court. Then on March 22nd, we postponed oral arguments that we had scheduled for many months. We have had those arguments since, which is very nice. We did it in much the same format we have here, except 2 lawyers were participating from different places and 7 justices each were in different locations, but it seemed to work out well. And I think counsel was happy with it, and all members of the court were very pleased with the participation. On March 22nd, we suspended in-person proceedings in all appellate and circuit courts. So that really began to shut everything down. And then we issued a continuance for civil and criminal jury trials through May 22nd. We also have an order in place that doesn't have an ending date for jury trials in commitments, which have that 14-day string on it, which makes it very short and difficult to handle. We postponed bar admission ceremonies, and we had interim rules set up so that oaths can be given for deposition when the person giving the oath is in one place, the deponent is in another place, and the lawyer conducting the deposition is in yet another place. So we've tried to work through what we can. So that's sort of where we are now. And our mission is how to go forward. We cannot stay where we are, but we can't proceed without a reasonable plan. And so my purpose in forming the task force and how I see its mission is to provide a framework of scientifically based criteria that promote safe interactions in courts and in court proceedings. In order to do that, we'll have to identify functions or places of interaction inherent in court proceedings that each county then will need to address with a written plan that promotes safe interaction that is specific to the needs and the concerns of their county. Now, I've had a lot of ideas about places we should look, and I'm sure Mary Trujano has been working on this sort of thing with Milwaukee County for a bit, and I'm sure she has some as well. But I think we need to look at facilities. You know, the facilities are going to vary. What is available to hold witnesses and jurors as we're getting ready for a court proceeding in Dane County will be very different than it would be in Price County or some of our other smaller counties throughout the state. We need to look about equipment needs and where do we get the equipment? Where do we get the masks? Where do we get the gloves? Where do we get the face shields if that's what we're going to use? We need to figure out how we're actually going to go about summoning jurors and witnesses, and what does mass transit have to do with how we summon them and how they're able to comply. We need to look at employee concerns. We have a lot of state employees, but we also have many county employees that facilitate the work in our circuit courts. We need to look at safety from an old-fashioned law enforcement perspective. So even though we're all concerned about being safe from being infected with COVID-19, we still have the usual interactions that go on among people when they get together in stressful circumstances. And I think the unfortunate occurrence 2 days ago in Milwaukee County, where 5 people died, shows that just because we have a pandemic on our hands, some types of bad behavior continue. So we need the usual law enforcement perspective and how to have that taken care of, because we don't want to forget it while we're looking at other things that are really particularized to COVID-19. We need to think about cleaning the courtrooms, the facilities. Who's responsible for that? How do we do that? We need to practice social distancing, and how can we work that into our proceedings? And I am hopeful that our medical experts will give us a lot of good ideas on how to accomplish some of our problems and some of our criteria that we want to establish to promote safe interactions, but we're going to need some help that mostly judges and judicial personnel simply don't have at their fingertips. So I'm very pleased that we have their consultation as we move forward. I foresee our breaking into working groups to attack individual ideas. Maybe there'll be one group that'll focus on facilities. Maybe another will focus on actually employees. How do we handle them to be sure they're safe? Because we want people to come into the court to be safe, whether they're employees or whether they're someone who has been summoned into court as well. So again, I thank you very, very much. I'm very appreciative that Diane Fremgen agreed to chair this committee. I will represent to you, having worked with her for a while, is someone you will appreciate in very short order. So at this time, Diane, I will turn the agenda back over to you, and thank you.
Thank you, Chief. And thank you again for all answering the email on such short notice. And this isn't usually how we do business, but nothing is normal these days. Just as a couple of housekeeping items, if everyone could mute themselves, sometimes we have some background noise or a phone might ring. It will just help so that we don't disrupt whoever is speaking to us at the given time. If you haven't named yourself, naming yourself is really helpful. If you have a question, I can call you by name. The only person I'm not sure who it is down in the corner with iPhone. So that might be helpful. And if you want to speak or if you have a question, raise your hand so I can see it in the screen. There is also a mechanism to raise your hand on the technology, but your regular hand sometimes is quicker and easier than technology. So as far as that goes, I think I will start then with Pat Brummond, just to give us an update on a little more into what he's seeing as a district court administrator out in the circuits. I did want to mention one more thing. There are 3 of us from the department or the Office of Court Operations and the district court administrators that are really participating in this group as resources to you. As we break up into subcommittees, and we can talk a little more about that, Pat Brummond is a district court administrator. There are also 8 other colleagues in the field that he can tap into as a resource. Ann Olson is in the Office of Court Operations with me and does a lot of policy work. We have legal advisors also on staff that as things come up in your subcommittees, we can offer some assistance with a much broader field than just the 3 of us. So, okay, Pat?
Thanks, Diane, and thanks, Chief. Chief kind of set this up very well. What I plan to talk about is just kind of the response from the circuit court perspective. Everybody should have received in their packet of materials a Wisconsin Supreme Court and executive orders related to COVID-19 handout. That's a timeline to just kind of help give everybody perspective about the many orders and the like that have really controlled how we have responded to COVID-19. In addition, I mean, the Chief Justice hit on many of them. In addition to those, 61 counties have also issued an order, an operating order during COVID-19. Many of those orders are expiring and are being reissued as we speak. The state offices, the state court offices, basically are closed right now through administrative bulletin through the Director of State Courts. All in all, I mean, that's the framework that we've been working under in the circuit courts. The orders vary based on local factors and pandemic conditions in various parts of the state. It's much different in Vilas County than it is in Milwaukee or Madison County. The message, though, I think has remained pretty much the same throughout the state, all the way from the Supreme Court orders down to the circuit court orders. And that message is that the courts remain open and will safely conduct as much court business as possible via remote means. And we're doing that. So what does it look like in the local level? The answer to that, it depends. It looks much different in Milwaukee than it does in Waushara County, where Judge Dutcher is, as an example. I would say, based on what I'm seeing, some counties are doing a bare minimum of court proceedings to get by. They're basically conducting the hearings that they have to in order to keep things moving along, at least at the minimal rate. But other counties, I think, are really embracing the technology and have jumped into the Zoom proceedings and or telephonic proceedings. And what I'm seeing with those is they're trying to get as much done as possible in order to kind of stay some of the anticipated backlog later on. As a result, again, as I said, it varies. Some courthouses are virtually empty. There's skeleton crews in the courthouses. I'm not aware of many that are closed, if any. Everybody's doing business in some way, either through electronic means or drop boxes or fax, working from home. Judges are working from home. Other counties have instituted a rotating basis where they rotate various staff through the courthouse. I'm aware of a 3-judge county in my district where the judges have split up the week, and the judges and their staff come in at various scheduled times. So if there's an outbreak, all of them aren't impacted at once and in quarantine at the same time. Other counties they look a lot like they did before. Most of the staff is there. The judge is there. They're still conducting their hearings remotely, but the people are there. Virtually every county, to my knowledge, has minimized the amount of foot traffic and public traffic through the courthouse. Many have it set up to where they are by appointment only, or have notices on the door of the courthouse or the door of the courtroom saying, if you want to participate in this proceeding, call this particular number and we'll provide you a way to participate. So, there's a variety of I lost my Zoom. Sorry, folks. I'm back. There's a variety of reasons why it varies. Again, it hasn't impacted everybody the same. Individual judges and local communities have a different philosophy about the illness and risk, legal culture in the community. And one thing I've found is size seems to have an impact as well. In the larger counties, there's a lot more moving pieces. So when Judge Trigiano and Milwaukee County reduces their operations to a minimum, it's much different than in Trempealeau County, where it's just one judge. So the impact is much greater in a larger set of counties, because you're taking down 47 judges to a minimum number, as opposed to one to maybe a minimum schedule. So it has made a big difference. What we're seeing is, at about right now, we're operating at about 31% of our normal weekly court activities being held. That's statewide. And again, it varies by county throughout the district, but statewide, we're about 31% of our normal number of court activities held. At the same time, our filings are down about 50%. That's a little misleading on the filings, because our large volume filings are forfeitures, traffic and forfeitures, and small claims. So if we have a significant drop on those, it really impacts the overall numbers, but has a different impact on workload. So again, we're down a little over 50%. It's primarily small claims and forfeitures. Forfeitures like traffic tickets. There aren't as many citations being written, so those are down. The major case types, your criminal, felony, misdemeanors, and the like, those are much closer to normal than that. We don't have an exact percentage, but very much close to our normal filing. What this tells us is it's not great news on two fronts. One is our high volume forfeiture cases for judges are not high workload, but our major case types like the criminal and the like, they are high workload. So those are continuing to be filed at close to normal rates, and the forfeitures are not. The forfeitures also provide a significant portion of the revenue for our county. The bottom line is, I think what we're seeing and what chief judges are seeing is that we're going to be hit with a pretty major backlog if we don't get things rolling. Obviously, we want to do that in a safe and effective way. I guess I'll close with it. The chief judges are actively working to encourage the judges in their districts to change from getting what they have to get done to trying to get as much done as possible during this time to help mitigate any type of backlog we'll have later. And I'll end with the work that we're doing on this task force. If we come up with some great criteria, will certainly help us get going as we can start doing more potential in-person hearings and or jury trials. So that's all I have, unless anybody has questions.
Any questions for Pat? And that was a pretty broad overview. Just a couple of takeaways. I think Wisconsin is in a pretty decent position because we do have a lot of electronic filing and e-filing and things available to us that other counties are not as, or other states are not as far into. So clerk's offices can go down to a minimum staff for safety reasons and minimize their operations to the public, but still get things done. And then the density of population. As we work in our subcommittees and groups, even if you're from a small county or from a very urban center, the framework and criteria that we are tasked with needs to cross over all of that. It needs to be general enough that they can apply it to any size county. So, and then the expertise of having public health and some guidance there. I have asked Dr. Mackey to give us a presentation, kind of talk to us a little bit about the virus, the spread, and what we can do as court officers to try and mitigate that in our operations. Dr. Mackey? Tammy, can you unmute? There we go.
Are you able to hear me? Thank you very much. Much of what I'm going to say today, I would like to believe is familiar with many of you, since we don't have a choice about becoming informed about COVID-19. There's no subject in my lifetime that has dominated the media like COVID-19. It consumes probably nearly half of what's on the national as well as the local news. It's remarkable. Yet we're only in the 4th month of the COVID pandemic, which started in one of the provinces of China, Hubei province, in the city of Wuhan, where in December, it was recognized by practitioners that they were seeing a number of cases of unusual pneumonia that did not fit any pattern that would normally be seen. And many of these patients got very sick and died. The first person to sort of blow the whistle, there's something going on here, we need to do something about this. A Dr. Li in Wuhan posted information about this pandemic on the web and was almost immediately attacked by the leadership of the Chinese government and was forced to apologize publicly. And of the paradoxes of history, he went on to die of COVID-19 within 6 weeks of his report. The pandemic started in Wuhan, China, and the rapidity of spread was truly extraordinary. literally from a handful of cases in this city of nearly 20 million people to many thousands, the hospitals becoming overwhelmed by the end of January. And February, they were simply almost drowning in critically ill patients, many of them in severe respiratory failure, requiring mechanical ventilation to try to keep them alive until they might get better and survive. What was further remarkable was the rapidity of international spread, which is almost unprecedented for any infection that I'm aware of or have seen in my lifetime. By the end of January, the virus, which had been identified and characterized within 2 weeks of Dr. Lee's posting and reported in the international medical media, this virus and the pneumonic syndrome that it caused had spread to many of the contiguous countries in Asia, but also to Europe and the United States. Our first case was in January, our first death was in February. And by February, it was very clear that the world was in the throes of a global pandemic, and WHO reluctantly called it an emergency. We had plenty of time to prepare for this pandemic because it was very clear that something big was happening around the world. But we appeared to be relatively spared. We'd had very few cases. But on the other hand, part of our lack of preparation, we didn't look. We didn't have the capacity to test widely or to identify what was happening. And we had very poor preparation in terms of pandemic planning. And as a consequence, when we started to see patients with COVID-19 in early March, it spread like wildfire. We went from a handful to several thousand to 10,000 to 100,000. By the end of March, we had many hundreds of thousands of cases and many tens of thousands of deaths. We were totally caught in a pandemic, and it was very late. Efforts to try to control it on a major scale nationally didn't occur until mid-March, by which time we had over 50,000 cases. Now, this pandemic should not have surprised us. This is only the 6th global pandemic of the past 20 years of the 21st century. Even more extraordinary, this is the 3rd pandemic caused by this type of virus, the coronavirus. In 2003, there was a pandemic of coronavirus that caused severe respiratory illness called SARS. This is the respiratory distress syndrome caused by this coronavirus. And it ultimately involved 30 countries, including Canada, and about 9,000 cases and about 10% mortality. It was a very scary outbreak. We were extraordinarily lucky that we were not involved and had very, very few cases in the United States. We did not have widespread, but it was a harbinger of what was to come. And when this new virus appeared in late December in China and was characterized, it got the name the Sars Coronavirus 2 because it was so similar to the virus that had caused the SARS pandemic in 2003. It shared 80% identity in terms of its DNA, RNA structure. And the clinical picture of illness with this virus, the significant potential for spread, and the significant mortality was very similar to SARS. Wasn't quite as virulent as SARS, but was far, far more contagious. This virus is extraordinarily contagious. and it explains why we've had the rapidity of spread. Why has New York City been drowning in COVID-19 over the past 6 weeks? Because it was introduced in multiple sites in the city, mainly from Europe, went from China to Europe and then rebounded back to the United States, particularly the East Coast. And there were many, many introductions into New York City, it's almost certain. And it was spread unusually rapidly because population density is a very strong predictor of spread. The density of the population in New York City is at least 4 to 5 times greater than Madison, and many times greater than many smaller cities or even villages or towns or rural areas. Moreover, in New York City, we have a great deal of public transportation where people are elbow to elbow on the subway or a bus, or they live or work in a skyscraper and they get on an elevator with 10 other people many times a day. So it's no surprise what happened in New York City, because by that time we realized we had a problem. New York City's course was predestined by the depth and breadth of the spread throughout the city. How is this virus spread? Most of the spread is probably by close contact with an infected person. And they call it droplet nuclei spread. If you sneeze or cough, a spray of thousands of tiny microscopic droplets emanates forward and is thought to go only about maybe 6 feet on average and drop to the ground. Well, we have learned very clearly that the virus can be transmitted far longer distances than 6 or 8 feet. And it is also transmitted by contact. If you shake hands with somebody who is infected, they very likely have virus on their hands. We all touch our faces every day, multiple times, and it's easy to pick up virus on your hands, and this is a very efficient way of transmission. One unique feature of COVID-19 that was shared with the Sars virus and also the Middle Eastern syndrome virus, the other third coronavirus of the 20th century, is it is so extraordinarily contagious that there's been an unprecedented risk of infection of healthcare workers. Healthcare workers have become infected and ill in huge numbers. If I simply look at the reports in the medical literature, over 30,000 healthcare workers have been infected already, 10,000 in Italy alone, and more than 9,000 in the United States as of 2 weeks ago. It's very contagious, which means that protective apparel and environmental considerations are essential to protect healthcare workers and to prevent spread to other patients in healthcare institutions. One of the reasons that nursing homes have been a hotbed or cruise ships is you have large numbers of people in close proximity without any special adjustments for the air. They are all breathing the same air. It's the common air handling system. And you have direct person-to-person contact repeatedly multiple times on an ongoing basis every day. And as a consequence, the spread in nursing homes and in cruise ships has been truly extraordinary. One cruise ship off the coast of Japan had more than 700 infected individuals before they allowed the people to disembark. So it's a very contagious virus. The good news is that we have learned to be able to protect healthcare workers by stringent attention to measures that are based on our understanding of its epidemiology, how it spreads, who is vulnerable. And in hospitals, we put patients who have known infection or even suspected infection in a room that's called negative pressure. The air supply of that room is totally separate from the rest of the hospital. It does not circulate. And the room is kept negative pressure with respect to the hall. So when you open the door to go in the room, air doesn't come wafting out into the hall. Secondly, healthcare workers who are taking care of critically ill patients wear full-length surgical gowns, they glove, they wear a head cover, they wear a surgical medical mask or an N95 mask, and they have a face shield. And they take all of this off extremely carefully when they leave the room. And we at university hospitals wear a medical surgical mask around the clock the entire time you're working, because we know that the virus can even escape from these rooms and may be in the hallways. So it's been a considerable challenge. We've been very fortunate at university hospitals in that most hospitals have had many, many infected healthcare workers. We've had only several, and they fortunately have not gotten very sick and are doing well. But it takes a considerable commitment of effort. Clinical COVID-19, interestingly and insidiously, if we look at the virus, is asymptomatic and does not make the person ill at least half the time. It's subclinical, it totally doesn't cause any illness. Yet the person who's infected has the capacity to transmit the virus very efficiently to those around them. And that's part of the reason that this virus has spread so rapidly and efficiently around the world. In terms of the community, it's been recognized how contagious the virus is, and in mid-March, it was very clear that there was a lot of virus in the community. There were a lot of people who had active infection. They were going to have the capacity to spread to their families, to their neighbors, to their work colleagues. And we basically shut the country down. It's called social distancing, but we went one step further. Social distancing is trying to minimize direct person-to-person contact and the opportunity for spread of the virus. And in the hospital, we add to that masks, gloves, other garb. That's not necessary in the community setting. The most important thing when you've got a pandemic and a lot of spread in the community is quarantine of the population. People stay home, go out as little as possible, literally only for medical reasons or to occasionally obtain food, and you are not going to be exposed to other individuals. And you don't get together with your friends or neighbors. You don't have relatives come visit because anyone can carry the virus and introduce it into your household. This was implemented mid-March and has been very effective. It's very clear the rapidity of spread has rapidly declined. The number of deaths is declining, and we're waiting for the virus to eventually run out of people to infect because there's not the opportunity for rapid spread. Treatment of COVID-19 has been a real challenge, because although there was great hope that many of the antivirals that have been developed for other viruses might be effective, to date, I have to state sadly that no single drug has been identified conclusively to be effective against COVID-19. We are doing novel things like giving people convalescent plasma, obtaining plasma from survivors who are well. They donate their plasma. We give it to sick people, and there's hope that that may be beneficial. But even there, we don't have conclusive data as yet. The most important need to control this pandemic is a vaccine. And vaccine technology has evolved enormously in my lifetime. There were less than 6 major vaccines used in the population at the time I was growing up in northern Wisconsin 50 or 60 years ago. Today, we have several hundred proven vaccines for a wide variety of diseases. And the childhood vaccines our children receive have had a huge impact. What about a new vaccine, particularly one for COVID-19? There's no infectious disease that I'm aware of in history that has had the intense scrutiny for development of a vaccine of COVID-19. Over 80 companies or academic institutions have developed candidate vaccines that they're hoping to take into trials in the coming months. There are 7 trials already underway in the first stage of a trial. There are 3 stages for vaccine trials. Phase 1 to simply see, is it safe? Do people have side effects or symptoms? Is there a measurable antibody from the vaccine? Phase 2 tries to expand that in a larger number of people. And if it's clear that you get good antibody, there's a good immune response, and it seems to be safe, you'll give it to thousands and thousands of exposed people to determine with certainty it does or does not protect against the infection. There are 7 trials already underway, as I indicated, and I'm really hopeful, much more hopeful, that we will develop a vaccine within a year. With this much attention, we're literally seeing a Manhattan Project on vaccine development. And the Chinese have already reported in a small paper that they have developed a vaccine that in experimental animals, basically rhesus monkeys, appeared to be highly protective against infection, with challenging the monkeys with squirting large amounts of virus into their airways. The animals that were not given the vaccine all died. The animals that got the vaccine, within 2 weeks, you couldn't even find any virus in the animal. It prevented infection totally. So that's very hopeful. And the vaccine trials, I think, are going to give us a vaccine, but it would be unusually rapid if we could get it before late 2020, at the very earliest. So we're going to have to control this pandemic by epidemiologic means, by measures, social distancing, and other measures to prevent spread. And I'm confident that can happen. SARS was controlled. When SARS hit, many epidemiologists, infectious disease specialists, public health experts were fearful it was literally the end of the world. This was a highly virulent disease, yet it was controlled. And within 9 months, there were no more cases and it never returned, which gives us some hope that maybe that could occur with SARS virus coronavirus 2. But we can't make that assumption. We have to develop a vaccine. Now, where do we stand on continued social distancing? We're controlling spread of the infection. It'd be very easy to say, let's just continue this at least till September. If we went at our current rate till September, our economy would totally collapse. It would be devastating. Half of the people in this country work in small companies or small businesses, and they are hurting very badly at the present time. Many have already declared bankruptcy. And we are going to have to open up the economy. We are going to have to resume normal social discourse, or there won't be a country left for us to try to do something about it. So we walk a fine line. Unfortunately, this issue about when are we going to open up has become politicized. One poll says, absolutely not. We'll stay hunkered down for at least another couple of months, maybe till September, and we may have to even think about doing this for a whole year. It's not going to fly. The other said, open up immediately. We've got to get going now, and that's occurring in pockets around the country, in states. I would propose that there's a much more rational medium course. I think it's possible to start to open up the economy if we put into effect measures to protect the public. And that has not been adequately emphasized. If we're going to open up, we have a responsibility to assure that we put in policies and procedures and recommendations that will minimize the risk of recurrent COVID-19 and to a flare of the pandemic in our country. And I'm confident that if we obtain cooperation from the public, that will be possible. And opening up, again, certainly must include the court system in this country. I have put together a one-page summary of measures that I think have to be considered if we want to open up the court system for in-person court proceedings to minimize risk. And I feel confident that we can minimize risk very substantially. If we can protect healthcare workers who are exposed to enormous amounts of virus on a continuing basis all day long, why can't we protect the public where their exposure is going to be far, far less? There'll be far less virus. They'll have occasional exposures, but with appropriate precautions, I think we can greatly reduce risk. And so right now, the recommendations for the public is if you have to go out, are to minimize your direct contacts with people as much as possible. Stay at least 6 feet better away as much as you can, but to mask and to have good hand hygiene. If you have gloves, you can wear disposable gloves, but good hand hygiene is very effective. The virus is easy to remove from the hands with vigorous soap and water hand washing, let alone the use of the waterless alcohol hand rubs. Now, I need to talk about masking because that's very important. There are a lot of misconceptions about the masks that are used to protect from infection. The most powerful mask that provides a very high level of protection to the person who's wearing it is what's called an N95 respirator. That's a fairly thick mask that prevents almost all tiny particles that might have virus in it from getting through into the airway of the person as they breathe. And it's designed to form a tight seal on the face to prevent any blow-by air bypassing the mask to get into the airway. This is highly effective at preventing individuals from tuberculosis and many contagious diseases that are spread by the respiratory route. The next level of protection is what's called a surgical mask or a medical surgical mask, which are used very widely in hospitals and in clinics. They're used in the operating room. This also provides a substantial level of protection against germs that might be in air particles or suspended in the air, but it's not nearly as effective as the N95. But good studies have been done during the SARS epidemic and even during COVID-19 in China, where they've looked at the impact of different masks worn by healthcare workers, particularly nurses, who are exposed to these patients literally continuously for an entire shift. And they have shown that a medical surgical mask that's worn continuously by people who are working with patients who have active infection provides a high level of protection and almost as good as an N95. And those are the masks that we wear continuously at university hospitals now. If you came to the hospital and you were working in the hospital, you'd put your mask on when you come in the morning, you'd wear it all day long. Because we don't know if a person in the hospital might have silent infection. To try to deal with that now, we're screening all newly admitted patients to try to pick up silent infection. But the screening is not 100%. It's probably about 75% sensitive for detecting early infection. The third level of masking is what most people are using in the public are usually these cloth masks. Many are homemade. You can purchase them. They have very little filtration capacity to protect you. So if you're exposed to a person who's coughing or sneezing and has early COVID-19, they're not going to provide much protection. The greatest protection they provide is that if you develop COVID-19 and you cough or sneeze, it markedly mutes the amount of virus you put out into the air around you. You are protecting the individuals that you may come in contact with by wearing that mask. I personally think that in settings where we're concerned for the public protection personnel, for instance, who have to work closely with many people on an ongoing basis, they should not have to use a cloth mask. At the minimum, they should use a medical surgical mask, which would provide a much higher level of protection because of their degree of exposure. And I think if we want maximal protection in courtroom proceedings until this pandemic is completely controlled and none of us need to mask anymore, I think that medical surgical masks need to be seriously considered for all of the individuals participating in a proceeding. The judge, the court, other courtroom officers, the jury, and those in attendance. And a second measure that I think would provide substantial protection would be air purifiers. In the hospital, in the rooms of patients who are at high risk, all of the air that comes in is filtered. It's called a HEPA, high efficiency particulate filter. And these HEPA filters essentially eliminate almost all microorganisms that are suspended in air. We use them to protect leukemics, transplant patients who are very vulnerable to infection. And good studies have shown they provide a high level of protection. If you are in a room and you have no white cells, you're very vulnerable to airborne fungi and other organisms. If you are only breathing HEPA-filtered air, you have a very low risk of becoming infected by airborne route. There are now portable air purifiers that are widely available that have HEPA filters incorporated that will continuously filter all of the air coming in on an ongoing basis. The larger ones are needed for large rooms. Smaller ones will do a very good job on a small room. And they continuously pull air in, and the air that comes out is almost totally germ-free. I think that those purifiers ought to seriously be considered for use in courtrooms. And I think that there's something that ought to be considered in many work settings as we open up the economy and people return to work. I'm disappointed that the federal government hasn't talked about this because there's good scientific evidence these can greatly reduce risk of airborne transmission and acquisition of infection by the airborne route. And so a couple of air purifiers set in a courtroom, one in front of the jury, one in front of the judge or the middle aisle, would pull in air continuously. It'd pull air away from the people into the device and also diminish air wafting to the person next to you or the person in front of you, because there's a continual flow of air being pulled in to be purified. The air coming out has got a very low count of organisms. So the third issue that I think would be important to try to protect in a courtroom are measures that are now well addressed by a document that OSHA has produced. I've included this in the handout that I've sent you, as well as a document put together by CDC, Precaution of the Workplace, which consists of all individuals who are coming into a workplace, and a courtroom proceedings is a workplace, should be screened medically, and whether we want to actually do screening for evidence of silent infection is up for discussion. But what is important is that every person coming into the courtroom is asked proactively, are you having any cough? Are you having any fever? Are you feeling unwell? Did you start to develop a lot of congestion? Is there anything different in how you feel today? And if there's any question about infection, they are excluded and tested immediately. And we can get testing done, literally same day testing. And if they're positive, you have avoided their coming in and spreading the virus. And this should be done every day. But it's something that we do in the hospital. Everybody who comes into University Hospital to work every day is screened at the door actively. Are they having any symptoms? And if there's any question, we pull them out and we test them. A couple of other considerations are that it may be appropriate to consider restricting attendance at courtroom proceedings for now, at least until we get our feet on the ground and are comfortable we can hold in-person proceedings safely, and limit the number of attendees other than the courtroom officers, the jury, and the defendant to perhaps families involved, and limit the number of families. I don't think it's a good idea to have full courtrooms with large numbers of people. I think that's looking for perpetuating spread of the virus. We obviously want all individuals participating in courtroom proceedings to be keenly aware of social distancing, and that continues on an ongoing basis, not only during proceedings, but after it's over, when you go home, to protect yourself, because if you are participating in courtroom proceedings and you're going to be working more closely with a number of individuals, certainly more than 10, maybe as many as 30 or 40, you want to maximize the likelihood somebody with early infection is not coming in to spread it in the courtroom. The jury, I think, needs to be separated, but that should be possible to separate them. I think ideally the court officers and the jury, if they could be separated by at least 6 feet, a minimum of every second or ideally every third chair. And so, and I think that's possible with adequate audio amplification. People can hear what's going on. The jury room should put the chairs around the edges of the room so people are separated, and you could put an air purifier in the middle. So all the air coming in off any individual as they speak or talk goes directly into the purifier, does not spread to the person next to them. And I think that that would provide a high level of protection. Obviously, it'd be important to have waterless alcohol hand rub widely available, and people use it frequently before they come in and after they leave the courtroom. And at the end of each day, because the virus can survive 2, 3, 4 days on surfaces, one would want to do a cleaning of surfaces that have contact with humans. The tables where the officers all sit, the judges' desk, and the area where the jury is seated. And that can be wiped down with a simple, common hospital disinfectant, which is widely available, is not expensive, and is highly efficient at killing the virus. It's not what we would call a deep cleaning. A deep cleaning would be basically cleaning down every surface, or even bringing in a machine that would aerosolize some hydrogen peroxide or hypochlorite so that every surface in the room was basically sterilized. I don't think that's good. We don't need to go to that extent. We do that in hospitals, but I think that just wiping down surfaces with a disinfectant would very likely be very effective. I would reaffirm, if we take good precautions that we know protect healthcare workers and patients in the public setting, it ought to be effective to protect the public. And it ought to be possible to resume in-person courtroom proceedings safely. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Does anyone have questions that they would like to ask the doctor? Chris, go ahead and unmute.
Thank you, Doctor. My name is Chris Rogers. I just have a couple of quick questions. Number one, you mentioned testing. Where is Wisconsin with regard to testing? Do we have enough tests in the state? And are we frequently testing? And then my second question is, I know I've read and heard about antibody tests, and I wondered if you could just comment on where we stand with that and whether that's going to be a tool we can use going forward.
Those are very good questions. First of all, the standard test that's been used for diagnosis of active COVID-19 is what's called a PCR. That stands for polymerase chain reaction. It's a ingenious test developed only 30 years ago that has changed the world of diagnostic medicine. It's possible to detect the DNA or the RNA of an infecting organism, even if it's only present in minute quantities. For instance, one germ in a microliter. So in a drop of blood or sample, they can detect one germ. That's extraordinarily sensitive. This test is a very good test, but early in infection, the virus may not be present continuously or in large enough concentrations to be detected. But for people who have established infection, the vast majority will be positive, and we can get the results of the test within a couple of hours. So it's a very rapid test. That test was not available in this country until mid-March. Most of Europe, most of Asia was doing extensive PCR testing of individuals at risk by early February. And even though a dozen companies had developed PCR tests, they were not allowed to get them approved by FDA until well into March. And that greatly delayed our appreciation of the magnitude of our outbreak in this country. We now have tremendous step up in testing. The United States to date has actually done more PCR tests than any country in the world. But we're a big country and we can rev up fairly rapidly, but it took a month to rev up. And I feel very strongly that for optimal control of this virus, this test needs to be widely available. It needs to be available locally. It needs to be available in every hospital. If I can get a PCR test for flu or HIV in the smallest hospital in Wisconsin on the same day, there's no reason I shouldn't be able to get a COVID-19 test. And we still do what's called tiering. Is your patient really at risk? Do you really need this test? And that's still a problem in many parts of this country. And it's greatly delayed rapid diagnosis of infection. When you stop and think about how important getting timely testing is, if I detect a patient comes to me who's symptomatic, I have to send the test to a reference laboratory, a CDC. I don't get the result for 3 days or 4 days. By that time, contact tracing to find the people I may have, if I'm positive, that I may have spread it to, it's way too late. We have to have the results quick, same day. Immediate contact tracing starts that same day. The contacts should all be traced within 24 to 48 hours if we're going to really control spread. And we're now at that level in Wisconsin. We're doing a lot of testing. We're doing easily 10,000 tests a week. And so there's a lot of testing being done in Madison. All the hospitals have the capacity to test. We don't have to send to any reference lab. We're doing many hundreds of tests every day at university hospitals. So that is the standard test. Now, the test you asked about is the antibody test. It's called a serology. That measures the footprints of the viral infection, but only well after the infection has been established. You don't have detectable antibody, usually for at least 7 to 10 days after the onset of infection. Moreover, if I do an antibody test and it's positive, that's only the footprints. Is that an active contagious infection, or is that a remote infection that occurred 3 months ago, and the patient does not have any active infection now. So that the serologic test is not going to be real useful for diagnosis. Where it's going to be important and helpful once we have an accurate serologic test is understanding the depth of penetration into the population. Have you been infected? Are you presumably immune? And we can't do PCR testing of the entire population. That's almost not physically possible. But we could do serologic testing of a lot of people. Germany intends to do serologic testing of every citizen in the country, which is an extraordinary undertaking. But they'll do it, and they'll do it well. And they've been very effective at preventing spread in their country. They've had a relatively small number of deaths compared to their population. They've done an excellent job. And the cornerstone of their control program has been extensive testing. They have done a lot of testing very early. South Korea has done a lot of testing, and they have done an extraordinary job. They have just stopped the spread in their country in its tracks. Hong Kong has done a good job. Singapore has done a good job. Australia has done a very good job. Australia has been very effective. We have a lot to learn from other countries in the world with regard to pandemic preparation.
There are a couple more questions, and I just want to let everyone know that the other two agenda items should go relatively quick. I promise not to keep you on this call for more than 2 hours, but I think the questions are good, and it'll give us some foundation as we go into our subcommittees. So I'm going to continue. Judge Hawley and then Dean Golden.
Doctor, thank you for your expertise. And the question I have for you, you have some interesting comments on jury trials. Certain jury trials can be postponed. Do you think come October or some other time in the fall, we may be able to return to normal on jury trials? Or even a year from now, are we still going to have jurors 6 feet apart?
That's a very important question, and you're basically asking what's going to happen in 3 months or 6 months. Is the virus going to be totally controlled, or are we going to be fighting virus as much as today? Anybody who claims to know the answer to that question is blowing smoke. The reality of life is that nobody knows. You can make all the models in the world you want, but models are based on what you put in for the dependent variables. And so as a consequence, a model can tell you whatever you want it to tell you, but a model cannot read the future. We do not know what's going to happen. I can give you an opinion, but it's an opinion. And it's not based on solid data. There are no good data that'll tell us with certainty what's going to happen. I think it's very likely that we will successfully control the virus within another 6 to 8 weeks. I would predict that once we start to open up, we're going to see a flare of cases. And most of the flare is going to be because the workplaces are not optimally prepared to protect their workers. And if we had a high level of compliance with relatively simple measures, even though there's still going to be some virus in the community and risk of spread, I think we could greatly reduce risk, and we could continue to open up and recover our economy at this point in time. So I'm a believer that I think that it would be very likely that we could have courtroom trials with juries by summer, by midsummer, late summer.
Thank you. I'm Dean Golden.
I'd like to build on Dennis's response to Chris Rogers' question about the testing. And it's one of these situations where we have good news and bad news. As Dennis pointed out, we were slow out of the gates, but we have done remarkably well, not only as a country, but right here in Wisconsin, in dramatically increasing our capacity to do the PCR testing for the actual virus. What you need to know is that in addition to running the test, you have to think about getting the specimen. And right now, that process is difficult, dangerous, and extremely uncomfortable. And because of the increased capacity to run the samples, we're now finding that there's a growing supply chain shortage of the cotton swabs that you need to stick in a really uncomfortable way to the back of somebody's nose, to the back of the throat, by trained personnel who will be exposed to large amounts of the virus. So they need to have quite the protective gear. And so that's slowing us down. That's the bad news. The good news is that I believe we are close to being able to have the technology where we can use saliva. Somebody spits into a cup, which is easier to ramp up, safer, less expensive, and that's really very good news. The other good news is that early on, a consortium was formed between leading biotech companies in the state, Exact Science and Promega, the School of Medicine and Public Health and UW Health, and Judy Faulkner's EPIC company, so that we could really, really ramp up the capacity. And we are in a very good space for the primary intended population, which are healthcare workers and patients who are ill and need to have a diagnosis. So what we have to think about in the context of this task force is that just as we are putting our heads together to see if we can open up the courts, there are other groups that are putting their heads together to think about opening up the UW campus system to business as usual and to opening up businesses as business to usual. So as we speak now, we have very good testing capacity for the original population. But as we begin to think about the tens of thousands of individuals who will need to be tested not once for a diagnosis, but on a regular basis in order to see if they can safely go to school or go to court or go back to work at their industry, that's where, again, we will expect that the demand will outstrip the supply. Now, the other good news is that there are other technologies or other approaches that are under consideration. But keep in mind that as we put our heads together on the best way forward to open up this vitally important part of American society, there are other groups doing the same thing, and that will stress the resource and the supply chain.
Okay. Anyone else with questions for either of the doctors? Yes. Corp Counsel? Unmute yourself.
Thank you. This is Joe Guidote. Quick question with regard to a patient who's recovered from COVID-19. Is it known whether that person is forever more immune from being reinfected?
That's a very good question. I think it's very likely that they are, but we don't know that with certainty as yet. And I was disappointed that WHO posted a opinion that there was a high likelihood, basically, that people would not be immune. That's possible, but I think it's unlikely because the acute illness is controlled. If you stop and think about it, we have nothing to treat people who have COVID-19. And they have a lot of virus. We can measure the amount of virus they have by quantitative PCR. But the virus disappears. It's gone. They get well. That tells us that we have an immune system that is capable of combating the virus. Otherwise, everybody who gets COVID-19 would die. So that tells me there is indeed a significant immune response. And I think it's likely that it will be sustained for a substantial period of time. So I frankly would be very surprised if there wasn't. The second reason I believe that is the Chinese data that looks very hopeful for an effective vaccine. That's if you can develop a vaccine that protects, it says that there's a capacity to have immunity against the virus. So to sum up, I think there will very likely be immunity. We'll know that with much greater certainty in another 6 to 12 months as we see if individuals who've been detected of having been infected come down with clinically active COVID infection. My bet is that it'll be a rare event.
Thank you. All right, Judge Stork, and then I think this will be the last question, and then we'll move on. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Judge.
Doctor, one of the recommendations you made is that this task force consider requiring that surgical masks be available for all participants in live court proceedings, including the jury. There's been a lot about the shortage of PPE. Where would we go to, and maybe somebody here does know, where we go to determine whether or not that is feasible for the 250 some courtrooms around the state? Do you know, or does somebody know where we would go to determine the feasibility of requiring that?
Well, that's a very good question and an important question. And I think part of the reason that CDC and WHO and many, quote, experts online strongly discouraged masking of the public for the first 2.5 months of the epidemic was concern that there wouldn't be adequate supplies for healthcare workers. That was legitimate, that's understanding. But to state that it wasn't going to work was disingenuous. The average person in the public only had to look, why are all the doctors, nurses wearing masks? Why are we seeing headlines of the dire consequences of not masking because there's a shortage? Masks do provide protection. To answer your question is, I think there will be adequate amounts of masks. We are now revving up on a major scale in protective apparel, and I'm hearing far, far less about critical shortages. There are pockets of shortages, but our manufacturing capacity and the global manufacturing capacity is very substantial. And I think that there will be adequate numbers of masks. Right now, I think it's essential that masks are available outside of the healthcare setting for public protection personnel. I think it's important that they're protected as healthcare workers. And I think it's essential for other areas of high risk. I look on courtroom proceedings, that's going to have a pretty small dent in the needs of the supply of masks that may be available. Medical surgical masks are much easier to make in large numbers than N95. We don't need the N95, the Cadillac mask. And I may be wrong, but I think there will be adequate numbers of masks. We may have to prioritize their use, but I think that before long, there will be adequate numbers. If there are not adequate numbers of good masks, then my prediction is we are going to see more flare of new cases as we open up than we would like to see. And it's going to raise a lot of concern.
Okay, thank you. All right. Thank you, Dr. and Dean Golden. I did get the one-page handout you referred to, Doctor, right before we came on this meeting. And if it's okay with you, I will share that with the entire committee.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'll get that out after we're done here today. Moving on, the recovery models piece. In your attachments, I had sent to you the federal judiciary's model for a phased-in approach to in-person hearings, to bringing staff back into the courthouses, and then eventually to setting up jury trials. And the phased-in approach is based a lot on what they're calling a gating principle, much of what Dr. Mackey is talking about. What are the numbers in that particular county and so forth. This was meant as a resource for you. It could be something that we model for Wisconsin, but by no means is it meant to be the direction that we're going. I think we as a group can figure out what is best for Wisconsin, but I wanted to give you at least a tool to look at what is happening out there. As far as what other states are doing, according to the National Center of State Courts, there are presently 35 states that are operating under a statewide emergency order and have limited in-person proceedings, just like we have here in Wisconsin. There are 39 states that have suspended jury operations for varying amounts of time. Most states had anticipated resuming trials by the end of April, but extended their suspension to either spring or later this summer. There are 5 states that we are watching as of yesterday that have orders that are set to expire this week. Connecticut, Kansas, New Jersey, New York, and South Carolina all have suspended jury trials until further order of their court. Michigan just recently announced a pilot program to test the feasibility of remote virtual trials. That pilot appears to be the first and only of its kind. We're monitoring that in the Office of Court Operations too, to see what that might look like. And as I get additional information, we'll definitely share it with this group. And Arkansas is the only state that we could find that has set up a task force similar to this. Arkansas's Chief Justice did a preliminary memo on the preparation for return to in-person proceedings. They did not lift their ban on in-person meetings. Their memo is very similar to the discussions that we are already having. So I think we are in a very good posture. It's very timely that we're doing this task force, and I appreciate that our Chief Justice was so proactive in bringing us all together. So we've talked a little bit about subcommittees and how those subcommittees will work. And I did a lot of thought on that overnight, so that in the interest of times, we weren't trying to invent that as we sit here on a Zoom meeting. We came up with 4 areas that we think we should break up into groups on. One would be in-person re-engagement. Recommendations for courts to re-engage in-person court hearings, and making those recommendations, like I said, is broad enough to fit in Price County and be helpful to Milwaukee County as well. The second subcommittee will be jury trial re-engagement. Facilities will be our third, and staffing will be the fourth. I've taken each of your areas of expertise, whether you're a judge, an attorney, the sheriff, and I've placed you in subcommittees already. I can read those for us now, or I can just send you the document. Is there a preference? Maybe I'll run through the list very quickly. Now, some of you I did not put on subcommittees, both doctors. I did not put you on, Judge Trigiano, I did not put you on a subcommittee. My understanding, you will be consultants to all of these committees, and we'll tap you when we have specific questions of your areas of expertise. So in the re-engaging in person, I have Judge Hawk, Judge Dutcher, Judge Brennan, Sarah Ward Cassidy from the Public Defender's Office, Chris Rogers from the Private Bar, and Ann Olson will act as a liaison to that committee. And I already talked to Judge Hawk, and she has a Zoom account and is comfortable with organizing and setting up those committee meetings. The jury trial re-engagement will consist of Judge Needham, Judge D'Amato, Judge Poros, Susan O'Neill from the Public Defender's Office, and Tim Grinke from the DA's office. Patrick Brumman will be the liaison. And Judge Needham, I spoke to this morning, and he has offered to be our Zoom coordinator and set up those Zoom meetings for that subcommittee. For facilities, I have Clerk Carlo Esqueda, Judge Haney, Sheriff Straub, and Corp Counsel Whiting, and myself as the liaison, and I'll set up the Zoom meetings for that subcommittee. And then for staffing, I have Clerk Hepfler, Judge Stork, Corp Counsel Gadotti, if I said that right. I am the liaison, but depending if they overlap, I may not be able to participate in both meetings at once. And Karen Hepfler will set up those Zoom meetings. I'll send this document to everyone as well, so that we are aware of where we're scheduled. So I wanted to talk, when you get into your committees, I think you should assign someone to be the reporter, someone that's going to draft the criteria for that committee, and then report back to this full group. Things are going to move quite rapidly. As you noticed, our next meeting is scheduled for Monday already, and then again next Friday. The liaisons to each committee, myself, Pat Brummond, and Ann Olson, are really going to be available to gather your questions, get any information or resources that you might need. Like I had said earlier, we represent an Office of Court Operations and district court administrators who can help provide assistance as we go through this process. And I think that's all I had on that. And are there any questions? Yes, Chief.
Yeah, I would like added to the facilities working group equipment. I think Judge Stork brought up where are we going to find the kinds of masks we need? And I think we need to know specifically where would we get them, how much would they cost? Also with air purifiers, we need to look at that and how we would manage to get them to the different counties, because all counties are going to need them, whether they're small or whether they're large.
Very good, very good. I have the opportunity weekly to participate with the Wisconsin Emergency Management Group, and it's a group of sheriffs, and I think Maury might also be on that telephone call each week. And DHS is talking about PPEs for law enforcement, and it's my understanding that all of those requests should be made through your county emergency management offices, funneling up to the state, and then they are prioritizing where that equipment goes. It's been a little tight, but I think things, as Doctor had said, will start improving now that people are manufacturing them a little more rapidly. So I will add those to that subcommittee. All right. So future meetings, as I had said, our next meeting of the full group is Monday at 2:00. We are hoping that the subcommittees can meet before that time, give us some rough drafts of where things are at, anything that you want to flush out, concerns that you want to bring to the entire group. I anticipate our next meeting will not be as long as this one, unless there are a lot of questions or resources that we're trying to bring together for the full group to share. Okay, Mary.
Yeah, I appreciate that this is all on a fast track. I think that's important, especially for guidance for folks who are starting to think about coming up sooner rather than later. Is there a time frame that we're looking at?
I'm going to defer to the chief on that one.
Ideally, we'd like to be able to have recommendations out to all of the counties to then make their individualized plans based on the criteria that we give them before the 22nd of May, which is when the court's order for jury trials would expire unless the court extends it. And we haven't gotten to that topic for a discussion among the justices. So we'll see how we do, but that would be my view on it.
Thank you, Chief.
And the chief is correct. The earlier, the better. Clerks of court, Carlo and Karen can correct me, but they need to summons and have panels ready to go if the jury trial is lifted and there are judges that want to start again on the 26th of May. So, okay.
In that regard, I would urge everyone to take a deep breath. And if we're going to reopen the courts, we need to do it correctly, and we want to do it based on sound criteria and sound principles. And it's most important that our first steps are correct, rather than causing a mess and then trying to figure it out from there. So that's the timeline that I would like, but I would urge all of the judges to have, and the clerks of courts and corporation counsel, to please have everybody take a deep breath. We need sound criteria that we will apply before we begin to send out jury summonses.
Thank you. Good. All right. And then one last thing, we had just a couple of missteps on our task force membership list. If I've spelled anything wrong or I've gotten a telephone for you wrong, can you send me an email and I'll make sure our list is up to date, and I will send that out to everyone once I get that updated. All right. Again, thank you so much for your time. I know this has been a long meeting to sit in front of the Zoom, but much appreciated, a lot of great information. So I look forward to talking to each of you individually and then again as a group on Monday. All right. With that, I think we're adjourned.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
A few seconds.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm John Henkes, President of WisconsinEye Public Affairs Network, and I'm speaking to you today to ask for your financial support. For 14 years, WisconsinEye has provided uninterrupted, gavel-to-gavel live coverage from our state capitol, the legislature, the Supreme Court, the governor's office. We're proud to continue to do that and continue through this time of crisis with important coverage. We are 100% committed to bringing these important meetings into your home or place of work. We've created online pathways that allow us to connect you live with these important events. But WisconsinEye needs your help to do so. At this time, we are facing unprecedented staffing, technical, and financial challenge. So if you rely on our coverage to stay informed on issues you care and need to know about, I ask that you consider a one-time charitable gift today to help us through this challenge. Whether you're following the DHS briefings, the Wisconsin Elections Commission, or leadership briefings from the state capitol, or any of the timely interviews conducted by our senior producer, Steve Walters, we could use your support today. If just a fraction of the thousands who value WisconsinEye coverage say yes with a gift of any size, it will provide a huge boost. So thank you. To donate, please text WisEye to 44321. That's WISEYE to 44321, or visit wiseye.org/donate. WISEYE.org/donate. Or you could send a check to 122 West Washington Avenue, Suite 200, Madison, Wisconsin, 53703. Again, thank you so much. Please be safe. Stay optimistic. We are Wisconsin.
This program is a production of WisconsinEye, an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit media network with a mission to inform, educate, and engage the citizens of Wisconsin. WisconsinEye is the nation's first and only independently funded state civic broadcast network, providing gavel-to-gavel access to government proceedings and events at the state capitol.